Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and I'm Charles Altendorf, and this is episode 58. On this week's episode, we're going to talk about the demographic transition model. I'm sure some of you have heard of the concept, or you probably straight up heard of the model, but others of you haven't, and I think it's very important to talk about and relate it to countries around the world and talk about it today. So that's what I'm going to talk about on this week's episode. So essentially, I'm going to give you a layman's term. If you really want to read it out in full, not layman speak, you can look it up. It's been around since 1929. It's called the demographic transition model, and it was developed by it was developed it was developed by a sociologist named Thompson. And basically, it says that every society goes through four, and some have argued five stages. So, if you will, the first stage, I'm going to go ahead and define it, and then we'll discuss sort of more. The first stage is one where high birth rates and high death rates occur. So basically, yeah, everybody's having lots of children, but they're also dying in all over the place from diseases, uh, poverty, fighting, just anything really. And then the second stage is when the society advances a little, so it causes death rates to start to decline, mortality start to decline. And then, and this is sort of when somewhere starts to get its sort of bigger, it starts to grow as a country, right? And then in the third stage, births start to tail off a bit. And they haven't completely tailed off. It hasn't reached the fourth or the fifth stage yet, which I'll talk about. But they're starting to tail off because you could argue somewhat in the beginning, in stage one and stage two, your birth rate is almost too high. The society is just having so many children it can't even support them. So that's what's sort of being argued there. And then the third stage, you've reached sort of an acceptable level of births while your death rate's still declining, and that's when your sort of population hits its peak in a way. And we'll talk about this a little bit more and the criticisms and everything. But in a way, you could say that's what some people would consider the golden age of the country. That it's there is a decent amount of births still occurring. The death rate is dropping. Technology is advancing rapidly, and so your influence as a country just seems to be country or society seems to be expanding around the globe. And that's when I think of that we'll talk about examples in a bit, but if we want to put this in my opinion, if you want to put this in American perspective, that would have been the late 1800s, early 1900s, because in the mid 1800s we were expanding, but we hadn't reached the point where we were actually having a healthy birth rate without a lot of deaths. So, and we sort of hit our peak in somewhere in there in the late 1800s, early 1900s, is sort of you reach 1950, and then after that we start to see a birth rate decline to a degree. Now, other countries that main ones that this guy was pointing out, and have still main ones that we talk about as examples beyond that today, Japan and Germany, that's been a long-term sort of thing that's been happening. While it's been happening at much faster rates. The decline in the birth rate. So then stage 4 is when you reach a point where birth rates are starting to become a concern, because you pretty much maxed out any type of you've reached the absolute bottom of accidental deaths or famine or poverty. You've reached the maximum amount your society can get of reducing deaths. And now you're starting to see your birth rates drop so low that they're becoming a problem, that you're almost not starting to sustain yourself. And then the The fifth stage, the really crazy stage that some people debated whether or not it exists, is if your society is actually having so few kids that it's losing population. It's negative imbalance. And some people have argued that you could say Germany and Japan have gotten there. And other people say, no, it's not there yet. You know, y'all are talking a bunch of malarkey. You just hate Germany and Japan because they're so technologically advanced. So anyway, so we'll unpack this a little bit more and talk about it worldwide. So first of all, why is this important? Well, you know, some people could argue it's not, you know, because it's well, okay. First of all, there's some people who are critical of it and say this isn't a thing. Um, I've only seen a couple articles criticizing the demographic transition model, and the one that I saw was written in 2009 claims, well, it's cyclical and societies rebound their birth rates, and I just haven't largely seen that play out. You know, maybe, you know, for instance, people like to argue the American birth rate's still over 2, and it is, yeah, and you know, in France it's up to 1.9 again, but these aren't and don't get me wrong, immigration is a way to increase your birth rates, but it's artificial in a way. And I'm not even saying that as a criticism of immigration, because the United States made its golden age out of having immigration with birth. It's more of a sort of, these births that are occurring don't seem to me to be occurring in middle class. So it's not bolstering the society. The middle class is still struggling. Although I think I am starting to see maybe vague signs that the American middle class isn't struggling as quite as much as it was when I got out of college 10 years ago. But I'm really hesitant to say that, because I've just seen almost what seems to me like a consistent trend of an absolute plummet of a desire of middle class units to make families in the United States and all across a lot of countries, you know, United Kingdom, Germany, France. So I don't know. I take a little issue with these people coming here saying, "Oh, it's just not true because we have some metric from one year that says the birth rates were higher." It makes me a little skeptical. And what's really crazy to me is this theory was put out there in 1929, and you know, I came across it in one of my geography classes in college in 2008. But it seems to largely hold true, and that's probably the reason why so many people still talk about it. And this guy was clearly a forward thinker, having seen this play out. I don't, you know, I guess he must have really been studying a lot of the world. Anyway, so yeah, other countries. So Germany and Japan, right? Well, and here's the other reason why I want to criticize some of the examples, and maybe I can throw some shade at the model. Okay, I don't think when this guy made this model, he foresaw China doing something like a one-child policy. And I mean, why would you? You know, they're the only. Well, I don't. I will claim ignorance to know of any other country that's done such a mass scale population control as a one-child policy. But you know, he just wouldn't assume people would do that. So China, in a way, didn't the birth rate in China didn't decline naturally, quite as naturally as the model. It still is kind of part of the model, and you could somewhat argue it's hit stage 3 or stage 4. You could argue it's in stage 4, but it's almost like it didn't come. The technology didn't ramp up as fast as it could have to reach stage 4. It's not like in Japan and Germany again, where they're clearly in a stage 5 of technology, and it's almost like, what are they going to do to get more births? And they do things all the time. They keep trying to. And I don't, you know, it's almost like it's a crazy thing, because you don't, you know, if you come up to somebody on the street corner and you were to tell them, well, technology advancing is going to kill our population one day, because they would call you a nutter, right? They wouldn't know what to say, you know. And I think that's why people largely, they want to find a reason to believe this model doesn't doesn't largely hold true, right? Because what does that say about our society if we just get so convenient and lazy that we don't reproduce, and it reaches a critical mass point where the society might start declining? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So that's sort of a tricky thing. I'd want to think that people are right, that it is a cyclical thing, and that at some point it comes back. But there does seem to be less people having kids in a lot of countries in a natural way, in a good situation. And I don't know. I've really wanted to think that that was false, but I tend to agree with the model. What it means for society at large, I don't know, because in some ways it seems like it's just an observation. Like you can't roll back the clock. You can't go home again. I mean, I don't know. You're not going to force people to have kids. Be like, oh no, you two are a couple. You're hanging out together. You're doing whatever. You've got to have two children at least to replace the society. I mean, nobody would be a proponent of that. But I mean, do we want to resort to, Japan is talking about, they make robots to take care of people, and they're doing that in China too. Um, it's a tough question. I guess I'll leave that up to the audience. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Do you agree with the demographic transition model? Do you think societies need to have a certain amount of births to sustain themselves? And I don't know. Do you need to force that to happen? So it's an interesting concept. I like it, and I like the debate it sparks. And I obviously I have friends who are very pro the technology community, and they would say, technology at all costs, and this is just a load of bullocks. But like, it seems to largely hold true. We if you look at my family tree, for instance, yes, my wife and I just had our second kid, but I was an only child, and my dad was one of five brothers. So there's definitely been a bit of a drop off. And my mom was an only child, but if you go back to her mother's generation, there's six or seven. So it's interesting. Yeah, anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section. I think it does kind of hold true, but it may be a bit slower, not quite as abrupt as people want to make it out to be, and I don't really know how it reverses. I don't think it does reverse. So, anyway, let me know what you think. Peace.